Thank you for joining us for this reboot of one of the most popular presentations from this year's IdeaScale Open Nation. Every year we send out a survey to ask people which presentations that they found most useful, and Heather's presentation was definitely one of the top voted this year. We're excited to get started here, but before we begin, I just wanted to let you know how we're managing our time here. In a moment, I'm going to hand everything over to Heather Chappell. She's the Civic Innovation Lead for the YYC City of Calgary program. She's going to talk about the program that they've built and how they've developed insights from the data that they've gathered. We're going to hold questions till the end, but when that time comes, you can type your questions into the chat interface or into the questions panel, and Heather will answer them. I also wanted to let everyone know that we are recording this webinar, so it will be possible to access it after the event is over. We'll send out notice to everyone who registered with a link where they can find it online. And of course, if you have any questions about IdeaScale or today's event, you can forward them to me. And in the meantime, I'm going to hand things over to Heather. Thank you for being with us today, Heather.
Working remotely today because we had about 1.5 feet of snow last night, and it's not showing signs of stopping, so I'm having trouble getting the front door open. So anyhow, thank goodness for technology. So yeah, my name's Heather with the Civic Innovation Program here in Calgary, and yeah, we're going to be talking about how we've been using IdeaScale over the last 1.5 years, looking at kind of using some of the clustering options to take ideas and make them a little more palatable for some of our leadership. So one of the taglines we talk about is that the best way to predict the future is to invent it together. And so part of what we're doing is bringing together citizens and technology to design the next generation of city services. So part of what we talk about is that in the past, our organizations were very hierarchical. They were really top-down command and control. You know, in our case, our city manager would sort of dictate what would happen, and we knew that if everyone had their marching orders correctly, then hey, efficiency equals success. Ideas didn't necessarily come from anywhere. They were really predictable. But what we're finding now, especially in engaging with citizens and with changing demographics, is that the world is a lot more networked. It's more complex. We need to be a lot more adaptive in it to survive as a government. And we can empower people to take action. Not everything needs to happen from within the system. So for our program, that means that we're really looking at building the foundations for a more open and innovative government where ideas can really come from anywhere. This means that the system that never used to be really permeable is starting to be more permeable. Ideas are really moving in and out of government in a really exciting way. And we can be more transparent. We can be more permeable to citizen ideas. Citizens can be a more dynamic part of the conversation. And for any of you who work in government, that is not only happening naturally, but it's also more and more an expectation. So part of the tools that we use to have that more transparent conversation is crowdsourcing. Part of why we went to the platform was because there was a demand for a better channel to talk to citizens and to be able to kind of pull these different data sets that weren't through traditional engagement. So this is a snapshot of our ecosystem from a moment in time. Okay, so yeah, this is a snapshot of the ecosystem so far. We actually, this is sort of older data. So right now we have closer to 6,000 people in the ecosystem. We chose to have both an internal and an external platform. So we have one that is for staff only, and that's primarily to talk about organizational efficiency. And the other is external, and that's where we engage with citizens. A big part of the work that we do is also in bringing people through the lab itself and having workshops that use human-centered design, strategic foresight, systems mapping to really look at the broader challenges that we're exploring through the data that we collect on the platform. So what we know is that we need to understand what the quality of the ideas that are coming in are, not just whether or not an idea is viable. We actually came from we kind of grew out of a program that really said, okay, well, we're going to take this idea that came in through another channel, and we're just going to march it through the organization, and we'll know that we've succeeded when check, the idea is done. But actually what we found was sometimes those ideas created bigger problems because they weren't looked at in the whole of the system. They weren't looked at in the impacts that they could potentially have on other parts of the system. So maybe we would have solved a challenge for somebody in roads, but it would have actually had a bigger impact on transit systems and bylaw systems. And so we really believe that a critical part of taking ideas through a system is testing the quality of those insights. One thing that we also have learned is that taking individual ideas through a system, at least for government, just wasn't viable. We call this institutional friction, wherein there's a whole lot that's going on in the system, and it's really challenging to march single ideas through a system. This actually meant that we failed to really move ideas through the system in the first year that we were trying this way of working. Part of that was, leadership maybe didn't see some of the ideas as really, really valuable. Part of it was that we hadn't really collected a better understanding of what the quality was, what the broader impact to the system was. And part of it is just that sometimes the ideas didn't make sense for the organization. So what we found was that it was really critical for us to be able to analyze the data more effectively. Part of how we did that was we did use some of the tagging tools that were available. They've since grown quite a bit, and we're using them more robustly now. But we said, okay, we need to be able to tag these things, these many ideas, these 560 ideas that come in, so that we can start telling the story of what they actually mean for the organization more effectively. So I hope you can see this slide. What it's saying is that we took different frames to be able to tell that story to our leadership. So perhaps we were talking about them through lines of service, having to do with, is this related to transportation? Is it related to ICT? Is it related to environment? We also map them to our leadership strategic plan. So is it about building a great city? We map them to our council priorities. We map them to different business units. And what this data kind of gave us was a bit of a heat map to be able to tell us where were ideas poking hotspots in the organization, where we knew we would maybe have to talk to certain teams more than others. And there was some interesting learnings around people. A lot of the ideas that came in were actually talking about improving quality of life more than they were about efficiency of the system, which is one of the assumptions our leadership had when they first launched our program. So yeah, this is again just kind of looking at different ways we were trying to map where ideas were coming in and who was submitting them, who might benefit the most from them. We found this was a really critical tool, again, in being able to tell that story to City Council, to other citizens, and to our leadership. So this again is just another kind of, because people are visual learners, we really kind of took a whole lot of tasks of how we could show the way this data was kind of flowing through the organization. So this is just another kind of shot of showing how this massive amount of ideas that were coming in on the left-hand side, by looking at them through different frames, we were able to generate clusters of ideas that told us more holistic stories. So the tags that are on the right side represent how we clustered these ideas to be able to tell a more impactful story. So we talked about blockchain, we talked about more than voting. More than voting was looking at ways to engage citizens more effectively in virtual voting. We talked about Wi-Fi connectivity, civic accelerators, citizen science, how might we be more experimental, resilient smart cities, building information management, just to name a few. So these clusters of ideas were really a way to say big problems are holistic and connected to many opportunities. Great opportunities really emerge at the crossroads of ideas, and by looking at them as a connected system. They don't necessarily emerge from one single idea. So we called those clusters of ideas opportunity reports. And we found this to be an effective way of telling the story to our leadership of what was emerging out of the data that we were collecting. These compelling opportunities gave a more engaging story to be able to share with the organization what we were hearing and how we might carry them forward. Another piece that we really learned was that for governments especially, and I'm not sure how true this is for industry organizations, but it's quite easy for us to tackle ideas that are what we call mainstream. So this diagram is showing that there's sort of three types of ideas that we believe can come in through the system. The mainstream ideas are really easy to assess and adopt. And so the risk profile is relatively low. The impact to the organization, you can understand it easily. So the example we use there is that one of our teams in fire has a sub-community on the platform, and they had some suggestions around things like moving a ladder to a more efficient spot. Well, that was easy. Those were easy to do. Maturing opportunities are less known. They're a little more uncertain. So maybe there's something that you keep an eye on, and maybe there's something that you say, hey, in the next year or two, we should really pay more attention to this. What we found was the vast amount of opportunity reports that we were exploring were in that emerging area. So they were future forward, they were less known, and quite often the corporation's response would be to explore and monitor them. But we actually found it was really critical to be able to continue to poke at those ideas, poke at those opportunity reports through experimentation, and help the organization explore emerging opportunities sooner than they may have. So yeah, this is called the Knevin model. I think when I had spoken at the conference, I talked about how folks from the military might be familiar with this model, but it's really ways that leadership can react to complex challenges. And what we believe is that it's when the situations that we face are complex, which emerging opportunities often are, that's where design in government and the human-centered design, the strategic foresight work that we do becomes really critical, because it helps us to understand the opportunities that are in front of us and take on risk in a more effective way. So yeah, again, as I was saying, part of what we do is to say, we can take on low-cost experiments. For government, the idea of a pilot, at least at the city, is often a really complex 2-year process where a whole lot of time and money is invested in exploring something. And part of what we're saying with these opportunity reports and with looking at these ideas through clusters is that maybe if we just test a few things quickly, rapidly, scrappily, we'll learn something that we never knew that'll either lead us to dive a little deeper or to say this isn't the right thing. Low cost rapid prototypes based on some of what had come in on the platform. So that's all I had, and I apologize for the poor quality of the screen share.
Thank you, Heather. That was great. It was. I love those pictures of you guys in the lab coats at the end there. So now is the time for people to start putting in their questions to the Q&A box here. I'll field some of them to Heather, but we did have a few that we got as you were talking or in advance. And one person had asked, what was one of the themes, the emerging things that you were most surprised by or that you learned the most?
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, did I cut out? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So one of the questions that we got in advance was about what was one of the emerging themes that you were most surprised by or that you learned the most from?
The emerging themes that we learned the most from. Again, I think the biggest surprise for we really didn't know what was going to come out of the platform when we launched it. But there was certainly an assumption on the part of our leadership that efficiency-based ideas were going to be the most prevalent. And what we found was people cared a whole lot more about the quality of their life. And quality of life ideas are actually, in some cases, more challenging because we can improve a form relatively easily. And that can make government more efficient. But a quality of life challenge is something that's a lot more complex and it involves a bigger system.
Somebody here asked, how is this approach different than what you might have learned from a focus group or polling?
Yeah, I think our learning with focus groups and polling has been that you end up asking really directed questions, and so you get really directed answers. Whereas with open ideation, you don't direct the conversation in any way, and people can share what really matters most to them. So we as a lab, we don't do any focus groups or polling ourselves. We have a research team that does that kind of work, but more and more we're kind of seeing this interesting intersection between what our citizen satisfaction survey is saying and the really different kind of data that's emerging from the conversations we're having on the platform.
Somebody here has asked, how do you check the quality of an idea?
Yeah, I think that's exactly been the crux of this whole process for us. It's again, we found that it's in not to say no, one idea is never a quality idea, but the quality of ideas became much richer when we looked at them in clusters. So ideas that were not necessarily quote unquote quality ideas became richer when we looked at them as part of a broader system. So that's where the tagging and the clustering became really key for us.
It's interesting. It reminds me of the Stephen Johnson, Where Good Ideas Come From, where he talks about like the more you connect and network an idea, the more disruptive and transformative it can become. Um, Somebody here asked, was it more challenging to convince your residents or politicians to adopt this approach?
That's a great question. Our politicians had good good uptake at the beginning, and then we haven't engaged them as effectively as we could have, and so now we find it's really around particular campaigns that we get bigger uptake if it's something that they care about. With residents, I think it's the same. It really depends on the question that you're asking, and it depends on what the pain point that they're feeling at the time is. So, for example, on a day like today, where snow clearing is a problem, and the city is basically at a standstill, we might hear more from people as they're sitting on the bus or as they're waiting in traffic about what that might look like to improve their life.
Well, and then to that end, how do you respond to volumes of ideas that are in the hundreds so that all the submitters feel heard?
Yeah, that's something that we're working on. Because we'll always respond back to an idea submitter saying, thank you for your idea. And now with the new tools, it's easier for us to show them how their idea has been clustered into an opportunity report. Part of the challenge of working both online and offline by hosting workshops in the lab is that we found when we are hosting those workshops in the lab, when we're out on trained platforms in our lab coats talking to citizens, it's really critical to document that journey so that you can then put it back online later so that people feel like they were brought on the journey. But that's something that we're still working on to figure out what is the best way to give people both a robust experience being engaged on the platform, and then also, because rapid prototyping is such a critical part of what we do, how do we keep bringing them along on that journey? So it's something we're really working on this year, but it's evolving, I would say.
I mean, we have another question kind of right along those lines. Somebody said that they love that you do the rapid and scrappy prototyping, but what are the challenges in bringing other people along in this process? Like, are some people, they don't want to work in this open-ended fashion? How do you bring them along on that journey too?
Yeah. So I guess the example I can give is there was a cluster of ideas that had come in that led to an opportunity report around drones. And basically we have fairly tight regulations in the city around who can fly drones where. But we know that this technology is only going to come more fast and furious, and likely we'll have something like drone delivery in the next, 5 years. So we ran a couple of experiments where we rented out an indoor soccer center. We flew drones over people. We set up a fake streetscape. And we were asking citizens sort of, how does this feel for you having this experience? What does this mean for you in your everyday life? If drones were to come, what does the city need to be aware of in terms of this experience? And to kind of take it from what the opportunity report was to that experience, it was just about really kind of sharing that opportunity and then again reporting back online through several channels. Sometimes you end up catching people on the back end too. So by sharing the report afterwards, it can lead people back to the crowdsourcing platform. So it sort of ends up being this continuous cycle where you hope that through rapid prototyping, you engage new people too.
Interesting. Somebody's asked, what metrics of success matter most to you?
Yeah, I think that's something we've really been challenged with over the last year, because for our leadership, metrics of success mean how many ideas did you complete? And again, what we found very early on in the program when we were using some different methodology was that actually I could complete 30 ideas out of 30 ideas, but those 30 ideas might have really dangerous impacts to the organization in the long run. And so number of ideas checked off on a box wasn't the best way for us to measure our success. Mm-hmm. So we are trying to talk about it more in terms of how do we know that the opportunity, like if we know we can explore an emerging opportunity and test it rapidly and learn about it, then what is the risk that we as an organization can actually avoid? What are the things that we can learn that can make us a more adaptive, future forward organization that can plan more effectively?
So lessons learned is a metric for success for you as well then.
Yes, and the capacity to kind of tell that story and the impact to citizens.
Do you have any incentives for the program to participate?
No.
No. And then someone's asked here, if you accept someone's idea, do you allow the proponent of that idea to be part of the prototyping and testing? I know, like you said, you share out some of the videos of that testing happening, but do you ever invite your participants into other parts of the process?
Yeah, we have particularly for the voter experience prototypes that we did. Those were all idea submitters were also engaged in that process, but that's also something that we're trying to look at. How can we kind of do both? So how can we prototype with participants on the platform? And then if we can only host a workshop with 20 people, what does that look like? So we're going to be trying that in a few weeks. We're launching a challenge around smart cities. And a big component of the intake for those ideas is happening online, but then we're going to be offering up a to be determined amount of spots, maybe 20 spots, to anyone who participates in the challenge to come into the workshop and be part of that. And then it'll go back on the platform after, but we're trying to kind of use that hybrid approach more.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I know we're at our time here today, and I'm really excited about what you guys are doing. I know you've got big plans for 2018 too, so maybe we'll have you back for the Where Are They Now next year, Heather.
Sure.
Okay. Thanks to everyone for attending. We'll be posting the link to the recording online, and have a great day, everybody. Enjoy the weekend.